The great hall of Blackmere House blazed with 200 candles. The night Duchess Isolde Vane made the mistake that would change everything. The chandeliers spilled gold light across marble floors, across silk gowns and powdered faces, across the careful, constructed smiles of 40 guests who had come dressed for pleasure and stayed, as English aristocrats always did, for the gossip. Isolde had not meant to dance. She had meant to stand beautifully at her husband's side, a decoration in pale blue satin, silent and elegant as the vases of white roses lining the far wall. But then the quartet played the opening notes of a Viennese waltz, a waltz she had loved since she was 7 years old, and something in her chest simply came alive. She stepped onto the floor before she realized her feet were moving. She lifted her arms. She closed her eyes. For 43 seconds, Duchess Isolde Vane forgot where she was, forgot who she was supposed to be, and simply danced. Her body moved the way it had once moved, freely, honestly, with joy she had buried so deep she thought it was dead. It was the most alive she had been in 3 years of marriage. And it destroyed her. The laughter began near the fireplace, where Lady Rosalind Thatch stood with a glass of champagne frozen halfway to her perfect lips. Rosalind was the kind of beautiful that required significant investment, honeygold hair dressed with diamonds, a gown of deep garnet silk, shoulders bare and pale as fresh snow. She had a mouth built for 2 things, flattery and cruelty. She had long mastered the art of delivering both in the same breath, in the same warm tone, with the same lovely smile. "Good Lord," she said, not attempting quiet, not caring to try. "Is the Duchess actually dancing?" She said dancing the way another woman might say drowning, with the tone of someone witnessing something unfortunate that need not have happened. The woman beside her, Lady Pembroke, covered her mouth with her fan. Lord Everley, who drank too much and therefore said too much, laughed outright, a sharp, braying sound that rolled across the polished floor and bounced off every wall. The quartet faltered. The music stumbled, losing its shape, the way a river loses its shape when something heavy drops into it. Isolde felt the sound hit her spine before she consciously heard it, a cold splash, but she kept dancing for 3 more beats, because her legs had not yet received the message from her brain. She stopped. She opened her eyes. And the first face she found, the way we always find the faces that matter most in a crowd, was her husband's. Duke Caspian Vane stood at the far end of the hall, tall and dark-suited and magnificently composed, his dark hair swept back from a face that women across 3 counties called devastatingly handsome. He had a glass of brandy in one hand and a conversation in the other, but his gaze had found her, across all 40 people in the room, with no effort at all. He was smiling. Not the careful, political smile he wore in Parliament when a bill displeased him. Not the practiced warmth he deployed at charity events when newspapers were present. This was looser, something almost genuine, the smile of a man who had found something truly funny. He was smiling at her. He was smiling with them. Isolde stood at the center of the floor, alone, arms still slightly extended from the wall she had abandoned, and understood with the particular clarity of someone who has walked into a wall they did not see that nothing she did in this room tonight would ever be forgotten. Not by these people. Not by Caspian. She lowered her arms. Lifted her chin. Walked off the floor as though she had intended every single step. Charming performance. Rosalind appeared at her elbow within moments, champagne in hand, smile wide and warm as a snake in afternoon sun. "You must teach me that particular step. What would we call it? The Duchess stumble? The Vane glide?" She laughed at her own joke, and the 2 women beside her laughed also, their fans fluttering like pale moths, their eyes bright and sharp with the pleasure of watching something go wrong for someone else. Isolde had been taught from childhood to smile through pain. She was remarkably good at it. Her face arranged itself into something pleasantly neutral, not quite a smile, not quite a frown, the careful blankness of a woman who has learned that showing hurt only feeds the people who inflicted it. "Thank you, Rosalind," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I do so enjoy a lively evening." She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman, not because she was thirsty, but because holding something stopped her hands from trembling. The footman, A young man with red ears and careful eyes did not meet her gaze. Even the servants pitied her. She felt it in the careful way they avoided her face. That, somehow, was the worst thing of all. Not the laughter. The pity. Caspian found her by the window 20 minutes later, once the room had returned to its pleasant hum of conversation and the incident had been folded neatly into the evening's entertainment. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who believed all rooms were ultimately his, which, in most rooms, was more or less true. He touched her elbow. The lightest touch possible. Also, she had learned over 3 years, a signal. "We leave in 10 minutes, he said. His voice was perfectly pleasant. His eyes were not. "You've given them enough material for one evening, I think." Isolde looked past him, out the tall window at the dark garden below, at the row of lanterns leading to the carriages, each one throwing a small, separate circle of warm light against the gravel, each circle touching nothing beside it. "I was simply dancing," she said, quietly. "Don't," Caspian said. "Just that. One word." The weight of it pressed down on something in her chest. Then he was gone, back into the glittering crowd, and Isolde stood at the window and breathed very carefully and thought, for perhaps the 100th time in 3 years of marriage, about the person she used to be. She had been someone who danced in the rain. Someone who laughed too loudly. Someone who was simply, unapologetically, alive. Her room at Vane Manor smelled of beeswax and dried lavender and the heavy silence of an old, expensive house. Marta was waiting, as she always waited, sitting straight in the chair beside the fireplace, her broad hands folded in her lap, her small dark eyes already reading the room before Isolde had finished crossing it. Marta was 52 years old and built like someone who had survived harder things than instructions, with a weathered face and the particular stillness of a woman who had seen enough to know that most things were best met with patience rather than words. She helped Isolde out of the pale blue satin without a word about the evening, which meant she had already heard. Word traveled fast among servants. Faster, really, than it traveled among the gentry, which was already fast enough to be remarkable. Isolde sat at her dressing table while Marta unpinned her hair, and in the mirror, she watched the careful blankness drain from her own face now that no one important was watching. What replaced it was Rora. Something that lived between grief and anger, something without a clean name. "They laughed," she said, not to anyone in particular. Marta's hands paused. Then continued. "I know," Marta said quietly. "I know." She could not sleep. She lay in the dark for 2 hours, listening to the house settle, listening to the clock downstairs strike 2 and then 3 and then the silence after 3 that felt deeper than any silence before it. She rose eventually. She told herself she needed a book. Her books were in her own sitting room on the east corridor. She knew this, her feet knew this, and yet they carried her down the dark hall in the opposite direction, toward the closed door of Caspian's private study at the far end. The fire inside had burned low. The room was warm and dim and smelled of brandy and the kind of paper that important men used for important things. She ran her fingers along the shelves, not quite knowing what she was looking for, not admitting to herself that she was looking for anything at all. But when her hand brushed the edge of a thick leather folder tucked behind a row of law books, too deep to be found accidentally, too precisely placed to be casual, her fingers stopped. She pulled it free. She opened it. What she read inside made the blood leave her face so completely, so fast, that she had to grip the shelf to stay standing. Her husband was not who anyone thought he was. Before she was a duchess, before she was a wife, before she was a beautiful, silent decoration in someone else's gilded house, Isolde Marin Ashby was a girl who danced in the rain on the cliffs of Cornwall. Her father's estate, Ashbycroft, sat high above the sea, a large, draughty house with thick stone walls and windows that fogged in winter and a garden that ran wild every summer because no one had the heart to tame it. Isolde ran wild along with it. She climbed the sea walls barefoot. She collected flat stones to skip across the cove. She read too many books in a single sitting and argued their contents with her father over dinner in a way that made him laugh until he had to set down his fork. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness and a laugh that, according to her aunt, was entirely too loud for a girl of good breeding. She did not particularly care. She had never cared what people like her aunt thought, because her father never seemed to, and he was the one she measured herself against. He was the one who had first taught her to dance, in the kitchen, on a wet Wednesday afternoon, when she was 5 years old and the world was entirely manageable. Her mother, Ilara Ashby, had been the dancer. She died when Isolde was 11, a fever that came quickly and left nothing behind, and for a full year afterward the house at Ashby Croft held its breath, the way houses do when someone irreplaceable has gone out of them. Her father, Dr. Edmund Ashby, was a quiet man who had loved his wife with the total, unself-conscious devotion of someone who had never imagined needing to stop. After Ilara was gone, he wandered the house for months, moving through it like a man navigating familiar rooms in the dark, touching things that used to be hers without meaning to, setting them down again with a care that was almost unbearable to watch. Isolde saw all of this and did the only thing she knew how to do: she danced. She danced in the kitchen while cook made bread. She danced in the garden while the groundsman tried to concentrate. She danced in her father's study in her stockinged feet until he looked up from his books and the grief on his face softened just enough to let something else in. "Your mother would have said you have too much rhythm for your own good," he told her once. She would have meant it as a compliment. That was enough. For Isolde, it was always enough. By the time she was 20, Isolde Ashby was considered the most striking young woman in 3 counties and the most difficult to manage in 6. She was beautiful in the particular way of people who do not know they are beautiful, naturally, without effort, in a way that made deliberate beauty look like it was trying too hard. She also had opinions, which she expressed. She argued land reform at dinner tables where women were expected only to agree pleasantly. She corrected men who stated things incorrectly, with a directness they consistently found surprising. She danced at every opportunity, formal or otherwise, and laughed when told it was not dignified. She was not reckless, she was free, which is different, though people who have never been free often cannot tell the two apart. Her father worried quietly, not about her spirit, but about a world that had not yet learned to make room for it. "You will need someone," he told her one autumn evening, "who is large enough inside to not feel threatened by you." She patted his hand. "I know, Papa," she said. She meant it. She believed, then, that she would recognize that person when he arrived, that a man truly large enough inside would announce himself simply by how he looked at her. She did not recognize Caspian Vane as a threat. That was the thing she could not forgive herself for later, lying awake in the dark of her Vane Manor room, that she had not seen it coming. He had arrived in Cornwall during the summer social season, a duke, young for his title, with 43 counties of land and a face assembled by someone with a refined sense of aesthetics. He had come to Ashby Croft to meet her father about a property matter, and he had met Isolde in the garden instead, where she was barefoot on the grass, arguing with the head gardener about the placement of a new rose bed. Caspian had stood at the garden gate and watched her for a full minute before announcing himself. Then he had smiled, that full, warm, unguarded smile, and said, "You are absolutely right about the roses. They want the east light, not the south." She had looked at him. He had looked back. "I'm Caspian Vane," he said. "I know who you are," she replied. He had laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the kind she had not expected from a duke of his standing. She thought, standing barefoot on the grass with dirt on her hands, "This one is different. He sees me." She had never been so precisely, so consequentially wrong about anything in her life. He was different. For 6 months, he truly was. That was the cruelest part. For the first half year, Caspian Vane was everything she had hoped for and nothing she had feared. He wrote her letters that engaged genuinely with her ideas, that asked follow-up questions, that sometimes disagreed with her and told her precisely why. He took her riding along the cliff tops and did not complain when she outpaced him. He came to Ashby Croft 4 times that autumn, And each time her father watched him with the quiet, careful attention of a man assessing the structural integrity of something important. Her father said, 3 weeks before the engagement, "He seems to value you, Isolde." That was the measure. That was the only measure that mattered to her. The wedding was small and beautiful, held in the Ashbycroft Chapel in October, with the sea wind coming through the old stone windows and her father crying in the front pew with the contained dignity of a man who had promised himself he would not. Isolde wore her mother's veil. She walked the aisle absolutely certain of herself. She walked it believing she was choosing freely, with full knowledge, with eyes open. She was. The tragedy was not that she walked into a trap, it was that the trap was so expertly built to look like the home she had always wanted. The first sign came not as a blow but as a silence. 3 weeks into their marriage, at a dinner with 2 of Caspian's colleagues, Isolde said something sharp and funny about a parliamentary vote, and the table laughed, genuinely, warmly. Caspian did not. He smiled, but the smile arrived late, the way starlight arrives after the star itself is already gone. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, he said, "Let me know before you speak on political matters at table. Some things don't land well." She had stared at him. "What things?" He adjusted his cufflinks with the smooth focus of a man not quite looking at you. "Political opinions. They make people uncomfortable when a woman leads the conversation." She asked, "Which people?" He said, "Important ones." She let it go that night because she was tired and newly married and because she told herself it was adjustment, 2 lives learning each other's shapes. She told herself that for quite a long time, the way you can tell yourself something quite a long time if you really need it to be true. The silences came more frequently after that first one. Then the corrections. Then the small, gentle redirections that felt, from the inside, like care, and looked, from the outside, like control. She put the leather folder back where she had found it. She slid it behind the law books with the same careful precision with which she had removed it, making sure the dust along the shelf disturbed as little as possible. Then she stood in the dim study with her hands flat on the cold wood of the shelf and breathed, steady and slow, the way her father had taught her to breathe when something was too large to think about all at once. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, until the world stopped spinning. She was not ready. She understood she was not ready. What was inside that folder was a weapon, and a weapon picked up before you know how to use it will cut you before it cuts anyone else. She was also, standing in the cold dark of her husband's private study at 3 in the morning, absolutely certain of one thing. The woman who had married Caspian Vane in the Ashbycroft Chapel had not known what he was. But the woman standing here now did. And the woman standing here now had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn, unbreakable will and a laugh that someone, once upon a time, had said was far too loud. She was going to use every single part of herself. Starting tomorrow. Life at Vane Manor operated according to a set of rules that had never been written down, because writing them would have required someone to admit they existed. The house was magnificent. 12 bedrooms, a long gallery hung with painted ancestors, a music room with a broadwood grand piano that no one ever played, a library that Isolde loved and visited often and always left feeling vaguely observed. The staff was efficient and loyal, she had come to understand, to the house rather than to any particular person within it. Caspian's steward, a thin, precise man named Whitmore, managed the estate accounts with an attention to detail that Isolde had initially admired and had gradually begun to find strange in a way she could not yet articulate. Meals were served at exact times. Guests were received in the blue parlor only. Isolde's own calendar, her social calls, her correspondence, her charitable visits, was technically hers to manage, but there was always a quiet adjustment, always a gentle redirection, always a small correction arriving through Whitmore or through Caspian himself, phrased so reasonably that questioning it would have required her to seem unreasonable. She noticed it the way you notice a current in still water, something is moving. You cannot see where it is coming from. And you are not yet sure, standing on the bank, whether you should be worried. Caspian was excellent in public. This was not a performance constructed for her benefit, It was simply who he was in rooms full of people. Warm, authoritative, quick with a compliment, slow with a complaint, the kind of man that other men wanted to agree with and other women found inexplicably reassuring. He gave visibly to good causes. He spoke at the right dinners. He sponsored the village harvest celebration every September and walked through it shaking hands with farmers' children, and the newspapers always caught the photograph at precisely the right moment. People across the county spoke of Duke Caspian Vane the way they spoke of a particularly reliable institution, solid, trustworthy, something that had always been there and would always be. Isolde had loved him once. She remembered it with precision, the warmth of it, the specific shape of that warmth, the particular feeling of walking into a room and having him find her immediately across the crowd. She missed that version of him the way you miss a house that has burned down. The address still exists. You can still visit the plot of land. But nothing of what made it home remains, and the standing in the empty space is worse, somehow, than if the place had never existed at all. The isolation came so gradually that she had not recognized it as isolation until she was already inside it. First it was the letters. Her correspondence with old friends from Cornwall, women she had laughed with and argued with and trusted, began to generate a faint, managed friction. Caspian never forbade her to write. He simply mentioned, once, that Cecily Farrow had been speaking loosely about their household at a gathering in Bath, and surely Isolde didn't want to give people unnecessary ammunition. He said it so reasonably that she had agreed. Cecily's letters received shorter replies, then shorter still, then stopped arriving altogether. Then came the visits. Her father came twice in the first year of her marriage, once in the second, and the visit dates always seemed to fall at inconvenient times, always required abbreviated stays, always generated a small friction that Caspian managed with exquisite courtesy so that Dr. Ashby left feeling well treated and somehow, subtly, unwelcome. Her father noticed the current in the water. What he said, on his last visit, was, "You look thinner, Isolde." What he meant was something else entirely. She told him she was perfectly well. She said it with the conviction of a woman who had practiced saying it so often she had almost come to mean it. Rosalind Thatch had been part of Caspian's world long before Isolde entered it, and she made certain Isolde understood this in ways that required no direct statement. She dropped references to shared memories, to private jokes, to events that had occurred before your time here with the casual precision of someone placing furniture in a room to communicate ownership without ever holding up a deed. She visited the manor too often and stayed too long, always with Caspian's easy welcome, always with that garnet-gowned warmth that never quite reached her eyes. Isolde had tried, in the early months, to be gracious. She made Rosalind tea, showed genuine interest in her opinions, complimented her clothing with sincerity, because Isolde was not, by nature, a hostile person. Rosalind had received all of this with a lovely, polished blankness, like a mirror that shows you everything and reflects nothing back. One afternoon, 6 months into the marriage, Rosalind had looked at Isolde across the tea table and said, pleasantly, "You must find it difficult, settling somewhere so established. So much history in these walls." The word history had moved through the air between them like a blade dressed in silk. Isolde had said, equally pleasantly, "History is interesting. I've always enjoyed studying it." Rosalind had smiled. No further declaration was necessary. The war between them had been announced without a single rude word. Isolde tried. It would be wrong, deeply wrong, to say she did not try, because she tried with the kind of determined consistency that her father would have recognized and admired. She studied the unwritten rules of Vane Manor's social world. She memorized family histories, old alliances, ancient feuds. She attended every expected event in the correct gown with the correct expression and said the correct things at the correct moments. She organized the autumn charity auction and raised more funds than it had generated in its previous 5 years combined, and received a single sentence of acknowledgement from Caspian at dinner that evening, and nothing at all from the wider social circle. She started a reading group for the county ladies that lasted 4 months before attendance quietly dissolved, not because anyone said anything, but because Rosalind had begun hosting her own afternoon teas on the same days, and the gravity of Rosalind's social position was stronger than Isolde's good intentions. Each failure was small. Each was also, in some precise way she could not quite prove but could absolutely feel, arranged. She was being edited out of her own life, one small, invisible cut at a time, and every time she tried to push back, the blade reappeared somewhere she was least expecting it. She began to understand what it meant to be outmaneuvered. She began, quietly, to study the game. The dancing was the one thing she would not surrender. She had given up the loud laugh, or at least reduced it to something socially acceptable. She had given up barefoot afternoons in the garden, inappropriate for a woman of her position. She had given up arguing politics at dinner tables. She had given up Cecily Farrow's letters. She had given up regular visits from her father. But she would not give up the dancing. It was not precisely defiance, or perhaps it was, but it did not feel that way from the inside. From the inside, it felt like survival. Like the one thing that was still entirely hers. In her private sitting room, with the door closed and only Marta present, she danced to music she hummed herself, or to the small music box her father had given her for her 16th birthday, a walnut box with a painted lid that played a mazurka in a minor key, one of the few objects in the whole of Vane Manor that was entirely, uncategorically, incontestably hers. Marta always watched from her chair with her hands folded and her face carefully composed. She never said, "Don't stop." But her eyes said it, clearly and consistently, in the particular language of a woman who has watched someone slowly disappear and has made the private decision to witness, completely, whatever remains. She saw them in the East Corridor on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She had not been looking for anything. She was returning from the garden with mud on her boots and a late rose she had cut from the last surviving bush, the kind of small, private pleasure she still allowed herself. She came around the corner and there they were, Caspian and Rosalind, standing close in the dim corridor in the way that two people stand when they are certain they are unobserved, not touching, exactly, but arranged within each other's space with a familiarity that required no touch to communicate itself absolutely. Rosalind was saying something low. Caspian's head was bent toward hers. He was listening with his full, complete attention, the kind of attention he had stopped giving Isolde approximately 2 years ago. He looked up when he heard her boots on the stone floor. He did not look guilty. That was what she noticed most sharply. He did not even look guilty. He simply straightened, fractionally, and said, "Isolde, you're early." She looked at them both. She looked at the late rose in her hand, red against her pale fingers, petals already beginning to curl in the cold air. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I am." She walked past them to her room and did not look back, and her face showed nothing at all, and her mind had never been so cold or so completely, utterly awake. She waited 3 days before returning to the study. 3 days of ordinary life at Vane Manor, breakfast taken correctly at the right hour, afternoon calls managed appropriately, dinners conducted with the careful performance that had become her primary occupation. She watched Caspian during those 3 days with entirely new eyes, the way you look at a familiar painting when someone tells you a secret about the artist. Everything is the same and nothing is. She watched how he handled correspondence, quickly, privately, the papers always turned face down on the desk when she passed. She watched his conversations with Whitmore, the steward, brief, low, ending whenever she entered the room. She watched how he looked at her across the dinner table, still pleasantly, still correctly, and she noticed, for the first time, what lay beneath the pleasantness. Something watchful. Something that looked at her and calculated. She had always believed his indifference was the natural cooling of early passion, the ordinary settling of a marriage into its grooves. She now understood it was something else entirely, the particular vigilance of a man who has something significant to protect and has been protecting it for a long time. She waited until Wednesday. She went back to the study at 2 in the morning. This time, she brought her reading spectacles and a steadier candle. This time, she was ready. The leather folder was exactly where she had replaced it, undisturbed behind the law books, the dust settled back into its original pattern. She carried it to the desk and opened it flat in the candlelight and read every page with the same systematic, unhurried attention she had once applied to her father's medical texts, because her father had taught her that the worst thing you could do with difficult information was rush through it. The folder contained 3 distinct categories of documents. The first was a set of estate accounts, tenant rent records for Vane's properties across 4 counties, spanning the past 6 years. She understood estate accounts reasonably well. Her father had managed his own, and she had helped him during university terms when the estate manager was ill. What she understood, reading these, was that the figures recorded here differed from the figures that appeared in the official ledgers in Caspian's front study, the ledgers that Whitmore maintained, the ones submitted to the Crown's property auditors. The differences were not large in any individual entry. Across 6 years and 4 counties, they were enormous. Someone had been recording one number, collecting a larger one, and pocketing the difference, quietly, systematically, for years. The tenants had been paying more than their official records showed. Significantly more. And the excess had simply vanished. The second category was worse. A series of letters, 6 in total, written in a careful, precise hand she did not recognize, described an arrangement between Duke Caspian Vane and 2 named merchants in the county town of Greymere. The letters were business in tone, cold and exact, and what they described was a scheme in which the named merchants, a Mr. Aldous Cray and a Mr. Fenwick Bowl, names she filed away precisely, had been encouraged to borrow money against their businesses using documents that guaranteed Vane patronage. The patronage had never been delivered. The debts had been called in. Both men had lost their businesses. The letters made clear this had been the intended outcome from the beginning, that the debts were the mechanism, the promised patronage a fiction, and the businesses themselves the actual prize, acquired at a fraction of their true value by a third party whose connection to Caspian was described in language so carefully elliptical that she had to read certain paragraphs 3 times to understand what they were saying. The letters never used Caspian's name directly. They referred to our mutual arrangement and the party we have discussed and as previously agreed. But the folder was hidden in Caspian's private study behind Caspian's law books, and Isolde had never in her life felt so cold and so completely, furiously awake at the same moment. The third thing she found was not a document. It was a single letter, folded separately from the others, tucked inside the back cover of the folder as though placed there to be forgotten, or kept close, which was the same thing for certain kinds of people. She almost missed it. She unfolded it slowly under the candlelight and found a hand she recognized immediately, because she had watched that hand move across dinner tables and society pages for 3 years, Rosalind's distinctive, elegantly slanted script. It was not a love letter. It was something more precisely a business arrangement, a record of an understanding, phrased in the elegant, elliptical language of 2 people who had learned to communicate entirely in implication. What it confirmed was that Rosalind had knowledge of the estate account scheme. That she had, in some capacity she did not specify, assisted in its construction. And that she expected, in return, certain specific assurances from Caspian, phrased so delicately that Isolde had to read the paragraph 4 times before understanding them clearly. Assurance that Caspian's marriage to Isolde would remain in its current form, which was to say quiet, managed, and without incident. The word incident was underlined, once, precisely. Isolde set the letter flat on the desk and pressed her palms against its surface and breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts and looked steadily at the candle flame until the world stopped tilting. She had the folder almost closed when she heard Marta's voice, very quiet, from the corridor outside, "My lady." Just those 2 words. Just enough. A warning note. Isolde closed the folder, slid it back into its place with controlled, careful hands, making sure the dust along the shelf disturbed as little as possible. Then she moved to the window as the door opened, slowly and without urgency, because urgency had sound. Marta stepped in holding a candle and the face of a woman who had made a decision about honesty regardless of what it cost. "I saw your light under the door," Marta said simply. Isolde stood at the window and looked at her. A long moment passed between them, the kind of long moment that contains several entire conversations. Then she said, "Come here." Marta came. Isolde looked at this woman who had dressed her and brushed her hair and watched her diminish month by month with a silent, steady loyalty that Isolde had never properly examined until this exact moment. "I need you to tell me something," Isolde said. "I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think I cannot bear it. Especially then." Marta's expression did not change, but something in her settled, like a person putting their feet firmly on the ground before a strong wind. "Yes, my lady," she said. Isolde told her what was in the folder. Marta listened without interrupting. When it was over, she said, "There is more. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid." Isolde said, "Tell me now." Marta had worked at Vane Manor for 14 years, since before Caspian had inherited the title, and she had watched 3 housekeepers leave under circumstances never fully explained. She had watched Whitmore, the steward, burn papers in the back grate on irregular evenings, always when Caspian was engaged elsewhere, always without apparent reason that the household could discuss openly. She had, 2 years before Isolde's arrival, overheard a conversation between Caspian and a man she didn't recognize, a lawyer, she believed, from the leather case he carried, about a family in the village named Bowl. The Bowles had been millers in Greymere for 3 generations. Within a year of that conversation, their mill had closed and the family had left the county entirely. Marta had told herself it was coincidence. She had told herself it was not her place. She had watched Isolde arrive at Vane Manor, young and bright-eyed and full of a warmth that Marta had immediately recognized as the kind of warmth certain people would regard not as a gift but as a weakness to be managed. She had watched the brightness dim, month by month, like a lamp with its wick being slowly turned down. She had told herself there was nothing she could do about any of it, and she had known, even as she told herself this, that she was wrong. She had simply not yet found what she was willing to do instead. "What do you need from me?" she said. They had been speaking for 10 careful minutes, standing at the window with their candles, the plan forming itself in the space between them the way good plans do, not fully formed at once but directional, gathering momentum, moving towards something that felt simultaneously terrifying and completely necessary, when they both went still at the same moment, for the same reason, footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the hesitant shuffle of a night servant moving between rooms. Deliberate. Slow. The footsteps of someone walking toward a specific destination and not hurrying about it. Marta blew out her candle. Isolde pressed herself back against the bookshelf. The footsteps slowed. Stopped, directly outside the study door. Isolde's breath went completely flat. The door handle did not move. A pause, 5 seconds, 10, 15, long enough for her heart to do things it had no business doing in a person who needed to think clearly, and then the footsteps resumed, moving away, back down the corridor and around the corner until the sound dissolved entirely into the silence of the house. Neither woman moved for another full minute. Then Marta leaned forward and relit her candle from Isolde's, and her hand was completely steady, which Isolde noted and was grateful for. "Tomorrow," Isolde said, very quietly. "I need paper, ink, and the full afternoon. I need you to keep everyone away from my corridor." Marta met her eyes in the candlelight. "Yes, my lady," she said. And then, with the quiet certainty of a woman finally doing the thing she had been building toward for 14 years, "Yes." The footsteps had belonged to Thomas, the night footman, on his regular rounds, a fact confirmed the next morning by casually asking which staff had been on overnight duty, a question that raised no suspicion because Isolde had always taken an interest in the household schedule that other women of her position never bothered with. The footsteps had not been Caspian. The study had not been checked. But it had been close enough to teach her something important. She could not afford to move carefully. She could only afford to move with speed while appearing, to everyone around her, to move not at all. She began that same day. Marta locked the private sitting room door each afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock, citing her mistress's need for rest, a claim made entirely plausible by the dark circles that had been gathering beneath Isolde's eyes for the better part of a year, visible evidence of a woman under strain that no one in the household thought to question. Behind the locked door, Isolde sat at her writing desk with the key figures from the estate ledger reproduced from memory. She had always had a precise, photographic memory for numbers, a quality her father had called a gift and her governess had called unsettling, and began, line by careful line, to build her case. She worked systematically, the way her father had taught her to approach problems too large to solve at once. Break it down. Take one piece. Understand it completely. Then take the next. The tenant rent discrepancies were the most documentable element, numbers that could be cross-referenced against public records if she could gain access to them without generating questions. She needed the official county rate assessments, which were matters of public record but not easily accessible from inside a private estate. She needed the names of the affected tenants, not merely the records in the folder, but the actual families, living in actual cottages with actual children and actual lives, who had been quietly paying more than the law permitted, whose overpayments had vanished into someone's private arrangement for 6 years while they wondered why they never had quite enough. She wrote lists. She drew connections. She mapped the scheme on paper she burned each evening in her fireplace, the key information committed to memory before the pages turned to ash. She did not trust paper beyond her own sitting room walls. She trusted her own mind, which had never once failed her. What emerged from the work, piece by piece, was worse than she had initially understood. This was not opportunistic fraud. It was architectured, built deliberately, sustained methodically, and it had destroyed real people. She found the first of those people by accident on a Thursday morning at the Greymere Lending Library. Thursdays at the library were established routine, unremarkable, expected, generating no comment from anyone in the household. She was in the library's back room, supposedly selecting charitable volumes to donate, actually examining the town records the elderly librarian allowed her access to because she had decided, long ago, that any woman who used a library regularly was a woman of sound character and could be trusted with its resources. She found the assessment records for the Greymere properties. She found the official rent figures. She found a gap of 32 shillings per year, per property, across 17 listed tenant farms, multiplied by 6 years. She was still sitting with these numbers, very still, when the librarian appeared in the doorway and said, apologetically, that there was a woman outside who had specifically asked whether the Duchess ever visited, and when told yes, had sat down on the front step to wait. Isolde went outside. On the library steps sat a thin woman of about 40 in a well-made but carefully mended dress, the dress of a woman who had known better times and was refusing to pretend otherwise, with steady eyes that spoke of someone who had practiced being brave before walking through a difficult door. "Your Grace," the woman said. "My name is Mrs. Phoebe Cray. I believe you know my husband's name." Mrs. Phoebe Cray spoke for 20 minutes in the quiet corner of the library, and Isolde listened with the full, absolute attention she gave to things that mattered most, asking nothing, interjecting nothing, because her father had taught her that the most valuable thing you could give someone telling you something difficult was uninterrupted space to tell it completely. Aldous Cray had been a linen merchant in Greymere for 11 years, a respected man, a careful businessman, with a shop that employed 4 workers and a contract that had appeared, 2 years ago, to offer extraordinary expansion, Duke Vane's patronage, access to the county's largest buyers, a loan secured against the business, guaranteed by the Duke's written endorsement. The loan had been called in 7 months later. The endorsement had been quietly disavowed. The shop had been seized against the debt. Aldous Cray had appealed to the Duke directly and been told by Whitmore that His Grace had no record of any such arrangement. He had produced the original letter of endorsement and been told it was a forgery. He had lost the shop, lost their home above it, lost 3 years of savings set aside for their daughter's schooling. He was now working as a day laborer in the next county. He was 44 years old and had the hands of a much older man and had not recovered, not fully, perhaps not ever. Isolde listened to all of this without moving, without blinking, without letting anything reach her face. Inside, something had become very, very certain. Isolde took Phoebe Cray's hand across the library table. It was small and cold and very still. "I believe you," she said. "I need you to know that clearly. I believe every word you have told me. Phoebe Cray looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has said this truth in many rooms and been met consistently with polite skepticism, with the well-meaning dismissal of people who could not afford to believe her. Then something in her face shifted, very slightly, like a lock turning that had been stiff for a long time. There are others, she said. Not just us. Fenwick Bowl, the miller, and 3 farming families in the north reaches of the county. The Patterson family. The Harnets. Old Mr. Drews, who had 40 years of good tenancy and was removed last autumn for supposed non-payment of rent, he has receipts proving he paid in full. Isolde was completely still. She counted internally. 6 families at minimum. Probably more, families she had not yet found, families who had not yet heard that someone with power was finally, actually listening. Underneath each of those counted numbers was a house that had gone cold, a child whose schooling had been interrupted, a husband whose capable hands now did work meant for someone younger, a woman sitting on a library step in her best mended dress, practicing bravery before knocking on a door that had always been closed to her. Isolde squeezed her hand. I will not forget you, she said. It was not a platitude. It was a promise. The days after her meeting with Phoebe Cray were the strangest of her life at Vane Manor, because she had to conduct them as though nothing had changed, while inside her, everything had. She attended dinner and discussed the coming social season with Caspian with pleasant, practiced ease. She played the piano on Saturday afternoon, badly, on purpose. She had discovered early that playing beautifully attracted Caspian's particular, cataloguing attention. She received Lady Whitmore for tea and discussed the Harvest Fund with convincing engagement. She was a woman in the full performance of ordinary life, and the performance was flawless. She also began to notice, with entirely new sharpness, how Caspian watched her. He had always watched her, she understood that now, looking back, but the watching had intensified recently, sharpened into something more deliberate. Small things. The way he paused when she mentioned the village. The way his eyes tracked her movements when she opened correspondence at the breakfast table. The way he asked, once, casually, how Thursday's library visit had gone. She told him it had been entirely uneventful, and he nodded, and looked at her for exactly 1 beat too long before returning to his newspaper. 2 people, managing a very quiet game. She was learning the rules faster than he imagined. The Grand Ashwell Ball invitation arrived on a Friday morning, brought on a silver tray, sealed with the Ashwell crest, a rising hawk on a blue field, addressed to both of them in the elegant copperplate of Lord Ashwell's secretary. The Grand Ashwell Ball was the most prestigious social event in the county calendar. 40 guests, selected with precision, held every 3 years, attended by Crown officials, senior clergy, members of Parliament, the people in whose presence England decided what it thought of itself and acted accordingly. It was, and this came to Isolde clearly and with the particular quality of an idea arriving at exactly the right moment, the only room in the county where absolutely everyone who needed to see something would be present to see it. She set the invitation on the breakfast table and looked at it for a moment. She looked at Caspian, who was reading his newspaper with the comfortable ease of a man whose situation was entirely under control. She looked at his carefully arranged face, at the practiced ease of him, at 3 years of her life consumed quietly while the world watched and called him a good man. Then she picked up her teacup and took a slow, calm sip. 6 weeks away. 6 weeks was more than enough. She would be ready. She was, she realized with a quiet, cold certainty that felt entirely unlike anything she had felt before, she was already ready. She had been ready since the moment her fingers found that folder. Rosalind arrived on a Wednesday, unannounced, which was her habit, because arriving unannounced was its own form of power, a small daily demonstration that she did not require permission to enter spaces that other people maintained. She came in a carriage of deep burgundy lacquer and emerged from it in a walking dress of pale green with a matching parasol, and she smiled at Isolde on the front steps with the full warm ease of a woman who has made a decision and arrived to execute it with the minimum possible friction. I do hope I haven't caught you at a bad moment, she said, which meant she did not particularly care whether she had. Not at all, Isolde said, which meant, I see you precisely. They moved through the entrance hall toward the blue parlor, Rosalind's heels precise and unhurried on the marble, and Rosalind said, lightly, Caspian mentioned you've been spending more time in the village recently. Such admirable dedication to local charity. The word dedication had the same sharp edge as history had carried at their first tea 3 years ago, a blade wrapped in good silk. I enjoy the library, Isolde said pleasantly. One meets the most interesting people there. Something moved through Rosalind's eyes, too swift to name, gone before it fully arrived, and they settled into chairs on opposite sides of the parlor fire, and Marta brought tea, and everything was perfectly gracious, and absolutely nothing in that room was safe. They spoke of ordinary things for approximately 12 minutes. The upcoming season. The weather. A new piece of music performed at a gathering in Bath. Rosalind was brilliant at this, at the full performance of civilized conversation, at maintaining its rhythms and forms with such complete facility that a stranger observing them would have seen two women of good breeding sharing a pleasant afternoon. But Isolde had spent 3 years studying Rosalind the way a naturalist studies terrain before entering it, and she could read every shift and delay in the performance with precision. The ordinary conversation was a waiting room. Something else was being prepared behind it. She waited pleasantly, drank her tea, asked about Rosalind's most recent London visit with just enough genuine interest to maintain the tempo, and she watched Rosalind's hands, because hands are the one thing that most people forget to perform. Rosalind's hands sat perfectly arranged in her lap, too still. A woman at ease has restless hands. She adjusts, reaches for the teacup with natural impulse, fidgets at small moments. These hands were managed. Held. Which meant Rosalind was in precise control of herself right now, and that the thing she was controlling herself toward was about to be delivered. Isolde set down her cup. She was ready. I wonder, Rosalind said, arriving at the point with the particular lightness of someone who has been building toward it all along, whether you've been entirely happy here at Vane Manor. Phrased as concern. It was not concern. Isolde looked at her with a pleasant, open expression. I've been perfectly comfortable, thank you. Of course. Caspian provides well. Rosalind smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt, the only restless gesture she allowed herself. Still, some marriages simply aren't a natural fit. It's no one's fault, truly, temperament, background, these things matter, and no amount of goodwill can bridge certain fundamental gaps. Her eyes returned to Isolde's face. I mention it only because Caspian has spoken to me, in confidence, in genuine friendship, about certain concerns. He worries about you, Isolde. Your restlessness. Your habit of involving yourself in matters outside the domestic sphere. He finds it troubling. The word troubling landed precisely where Rosalind had aimed it, directly against the threat Isolde had always known was available, the threat of a woman declared nervous, hysterical, unstable, committed to the care of a concerned and reasonable husband who only wanted what was best for her. She felt it hit. She did not move. How kind of him to worry, she said. Her voice was the most pleasant thing in the room. Separation, Rosalind said, abandoning pretense with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been maintaining it only as a courtesy. A quiet one. Arranged properly, with a generous settlement. You would return to Ashbycroft, or somewhere further, if you preferred. The continent is pleasant in winter. You would be comfortable. More comfortable, I believe, than you are now. She held Isolde's gaze directly for the first time in the conversation, and what was in her eyes was, Isolde noted this carefully, almost honest. Almost something human. This is not a hostile suggestion, Rosalind said. I genuinely believe it would be better for everyone involved. Isolde looked back at her with complete composure and held, very still behind her expression, the complete inventory of what she knew. The folder, the rent records, the merchant's letters, Phoebe Cray's story, the 6 families, the Crown auditable discrepancy that added up, across 6 years, to a number that would end not just Caspian's reputation but his freedom. She held all of this behind her eyes and gave Rosalind nothing, No flicker of recognition, no anger, no fear, no relief. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "I am not going anywhere." Something shifted in Rosalind's face. The warmth thinned, like light through closing curtains. "I see," she said quietly. "I do hope you've considered the full picture." "I have considered it thoroughly," Isolde said. She refilled her own teacup with the calm ease of a woman entirely at home in her own parlor. "In fact, I've rarely had more clarity about the full picture than I have in recent weeks. It's been a remarkably productive time." She smiled. Not cold. Not fierce. Warm, entirely warm, and completely, utterly unreadable, and the only thing more unsettling to a person who controls through visible intimidation than open resistance is the resistance they cannot see coming. Rosalind studied her in the precise way you study an opponent's face at a card table when the hand has just changed and you are no longer certain in which direction it has changed. Then she gathered her gloves and adopted the bright social tone of a woman gracefully changing subject. "Well, I shall leave you to your afternoon. The Grand Ashwell Ball will be wonderful, I'm told. Lord Ashwell has engaged a full orchestra this season." "I've heard the same," Isolde said pleasantly. She set down her teacup. She looked at Rosalind with complete, open warmth. "I intend to dance," she said. She let the words sit in the air between them with perfect stillness. Rosalind's eyes narrowed, just slightly, before the smile returned like a door closing. "How charming," she said. She did not sound charmed. After Rosalind's carriage disappeared between the elm trees at the end of the drive, Marta came into the parlor and stood in the doorway and looked at Isolde, who was still in her chair by the fire with her empty teacup and the particular quality of silence that settles after something important has happened and not yet been fully absorbed. "She knows we went to the study," Isolde said. It was not a question. "Or she suspects," Marta said carefully, which amounts to the same thing for a woman like her. "Yes." Isolde set the cup down. "She told Caspian. He knows." She said it flatly, the way you say a diagnosis when you have already decided to begin the treatment. "Then we have less time than I thought," Marta said. "How much less?" Isolde calculated. Rosalind's visit was a message from Caspian, delivered through a deniable intermediary, the offer of a quiet exit before something worse was deployed. The something worse was clear to her now, the machinery of a husband's legal authority over a wife declared mentally unwell. She knew Caspian. He had already laid the groundwork, the dancing, the late nights, the interest in village matters, the fixation on household documents, each piece separately innocuous, assembled together into a careful portrait of instability. He had the authority to invoke it. He had the social allies. He had, almost certainly, already spoken to a physician. She needed to move before he did. 6 weeks until the Ashwell Ball, Isolde said. She stood. She smoothed her skirt with the precise, deliberate movement of a person preparing to work rather than the anxious smoothing of a frightened one. She walked to the window and looked at the marks Rosalind's carriage wheels had left in the gravel drive. "We move faster," she said. "What exactly are we moving toward?" Marta asked, because she was a woman who had always dealt in specifics and had learned, long ago, that clarity was the only true antidote to fear. Isolde turned from the window. She had thought about this in the sleepless hours after each night of careful documentation, in the cold quiet of her locked sitting room with the knowledge sitting in her chest like a second heartbeat, what it meant to simply survive, to take the quiet separation, to preserve herself at the cost of leaving Phoebe Cray on her library step and Aldous Cray in the field, at the cost of leaving every damaged family behind with no one to stand for them in the room where it mattered. She had thought about it thoroughly and completely, and she had understood from the first moment that it was not something she was capable of. Not because she was reckless. Because she was her father's daughter, and her father had never in his life walked past someone who needed help and told himself it wasn't his place. "We need someone on the outside," she said. "Someone with authority, and no reason to protect Caspian." She looked at Marta steadily. "And I believe I know exactly where to find him." Duke Edwin of Carrow arrived in the county on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks to the day before the Grand Ashwell Ball, and his arrival generated in the local society the particular quality of interested wariness that preceded men who were known to take their crown responsibilities seriously in ways that occasionally inconvenienced people who would have preferred not to be held to account. He served on 2 parliamentary oversight committees. 3 years previously, he had initiated an inquiry into land mismanagement in the northern counties that had ended with 2 peers losing both their titles and their freedom. He was tall and weathered-looking, in his mid-40s, with grey threading into his brown hair and a directness of manner that people with nothing to hide found refreshing, and people with much to hide found quietly alarming. He came to the county for the autumn gathering of local landowners, routine, nothing remarkable on the surface, and he arrived in a plain carriage with 2 attendants and a reputation that moved ahead of him like the bow wave of a ship entering harbour. Isolde had known he was coming. She had known his name for 3 weeks. She had been waiting for him since before she found the folder, in the way that a person sometimes waits for something they cannot yet name because they do not yet know enough to name it. The county gathering was held at Holstone Park, a large and well-managed estate belonging to the elderly Lord Holstone, who hosted it every November with the genuine hospitality of a man who liked people and was therefore somewhat unusual in his social position. 40 landowners, their spouses, their grown children, their guests, gathered across 3 days of morning meetings, afternoon rides, evening dinners. Isolde attended as Caspian's Duchess, in her correct gown, with her correct expression, managing the social performance of her role with the expertise she had built over 3 years of practice. She spotted Edwin of Carrow on the first afternoon. She had looked for him, carefully and without appearing to look, and what she observed matched what she had heard, a man who listened more than he spoke, who asked questions rather than statements, who moved through a room without the performance of importance that most men of his rank felt entitled to maintain. He spoke to the estate manager with the same attention he gave to senior peers. He took note of small things. The kind of small things that most powerful people stopped noticing once they had enough power not to have to. She watched him for 2 hours before arranging to be in his vicinity. They met formally at the garden tea on the second afternoon, introduced by Lady Holstone, who had an old talent for placing people near each other and then stepping away. Edwin looked at Isolde with the direct, unperforming attention that she had already noted was characteristic of him, and said, "Your Grace, I have heard a great deal about Vane Manor's charitable contributions." It was a social opener. She took it as one. "We do our best," she said pleasantly. He nodded. "I also heard," he said, in a slightly different register, quieter, more deliberate, something interesting from a colleague on the County Rate Committee. About discrepancies in the submitted assessments for the Vane properties. And there it was. She had expected some opening, some careful signal, but not quite this directness, not quite this soon, and for one unguarded moment something crossed her face that she could not entirely prevent: relief. Large, sudden, the relief of a person who has been carrying something very heavy alone for a long time and has just been offered the possibility of help. She recovered in an instant. But he saw it, she could tell by the way his eyes changed, becoming a degree more careful, a degree more kind. "How interesting," she said. She kept her voice perfectly even. "Perhaps we should discuss it somewhere less visible." They walked in the garden for 30 minutes, enough to be observed and therefore unremarkable, a duchess and a visiting duke, an ordinary social exchange on an autumn afternoon. But what passed between them had the quality of 2 people simultaneously discovering they speak the same language after months of translation into languages that do not fit. He had been investigating Caspian's estate accounts through the Crown Committee, not specifically targeting Vane, but as part of a broader inquiry into land revenue discrepancies across 5 counties. The Vane properties had surfaced twice as statistical outliers, properties where the official submission didn't match the committee's own external assessments. Not enough to act on alone. Enough to follow. Isolde listened carefully. Then she said, "If someone had internal documentation. Actual records, not inferences. Names of affected parties, with testimony available." He went very still. That would change the picture substantially, he said, quietly and without inflection. She said, I want your word that action will follow evidence. Not careful deferral. Not quiet management for the sake of social order. Action. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing directness she had come to expect from him. You have my word, he said. I don't give it lightly or often. She held his gaze for another beat. Then she believed him, with the specific, bone-deep certainty her father had always told her to trust when it arrived, and the plan between them began to take shape. They made a brief, quiet agreement. She would provide the documentation. He would ensure the right Crown authority was present at the Ashwell Ball, a public gathering, 40 witnesses, the most important room in the county, where what was revealed would be witnessed by everyone who mattered and would be completely impossible to manage quietly afterward. He needed 3 weeks to position his people appropriately. She had 6. It was more than enough. They parted with the correct social courtesies, a brief inclination of heads, the kind of exchange that registered to any observer as pleasant but unmemorable. As she turned to go, he said, quietly, in a tone stripped of all social performance, Duchess Vane. Whatever it cost you to build this, I want you to know it is not overlooked. She did not turn back. She said, equally quietly, to the still autumn air, the cost was the point. I needed to know whether I was capable of it. She walked toward the house. The afternoon light was amber and thin on the grass, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and precarious. She felt something she had not felt since opening that folder in the cold dark of the study, something that was not calculation, not fear, not determination, something that was, astonishingly and completely, close to hope. The feeling was almost unfamiliar. She let herself have it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she put it away and went back to work. She had been back inside Holstone Park for no more than 20 minutes before she became aware that Caspian was looking for her. Not urgently, he would never be urgent in public, but with the calibrated attention of a man who has noticed something that requires assessment. She saw him from the upstairs window, crossing the garden below with a glass in one hand, his gaze moving over the remaining guests on the lawn with the practiced sweep of a man reading a room. He did not find what he was looking for. Edwin of Carrow was at the far end of the garden, speaking with Lord Holstone about something agricultural and entirely innocent, and so Caspian's gaze moved on and landed eventually on Isolde herself, framed in the upstairs window, looking down at him. She did not move away from it. She met his gaze from across the full distance between them with perfect composure, holding it as long as he held hers. He raised his glass, slightly. A toast, or a signal? She could not tell from this distance. She inclined her head in the appropriate social acknowledgement. Then she turned from the window and walked to her room and sat down in the chair beside the window and pressed her hands over her face for 30 seconds, exactly 30 seconds, because she was allowed that much and no more, and felt the full weight of what she was doing. Then she took her hands away. She looked at herself in the mirror. She saw someone she recognized. She had been a long time away from herself. It was good to be back. At dinner that evening she watched Caspian from across the long table. He was at his absolute best, warm, brilliant, the gravitational center of his end of the table, the kind of man around whom stories gathered naturally. He told an anecdote about a parliamentary debate that had the table laughing. He deferred graciously to the woman on his left. He caught Isolde's eye once, across the candles and the crystal and the flowers, and smiled at her with that practiced, proprietary warmth that she had, once, mistaken for love. She smiled back with equal skill. No observer would have seen a single thing wrong between them. That was the achievement, and also, she understood this now with a clarity she had not had before, the perfect metaphor for everything their marriage had been. Two people who had become extraordinarily accomplished at making something look like something it was not. She went to bed before the men came through from their brandy. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and ran through the plan, every step, every timing, every contingency, and she was ready, and she was afraid, and she had come to understand that readiness and fear were the same thing wearing different clothes, and that the ability to act through fear was not the absence of it but its truest form. 3 days after returning to Vane Manor, Caspian knocked on her bedroom door. He had never knocked before. He knocked 3 times. Precise, deliberate, entirely unlike him. Caspian never knocked on the door of her room. He opened it, when he came at all, with the assumption of entry that characterized his movement through every space he considered his domain, which included, technically, everything within Vane Manor's considerable boundaries. But this time he knocked, and the sound of it made something contract in her chest, because knocking meant he had decided to perform courtesy, and performed courtesy from Caspian meant he had moved past anger into something colder and more considered. He had made a plan. She put down the book she had been reading and said, "Come in," and he entered and closed the door behind him with a soft, controlled click and stood in the center of her room with his hands in his pockets and the composed, even expression she had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. He did not sit. He looked around the room briefly, at her writing desk, at the fireplace, at the closed cabinet in the corner, with the assessing sweep of a man taking inventory. "We should talk," he said. She folded her hands in her lap, the way she had been trained to sit since childhood, and said, "Of course." Her voice did not shake. She was profoundly grateful for this, in the private, internal way of a person who knows exactly what they have just accomplished and does not need anyone to confirm it. He spoke in the measured, clinical tone of a man explaining a situation to someone he considers less informed than himself. He said he was aware she had been asking questions in the village. He said he was aware she had been spending unusual amounts of time reviewing household documents. He used the phrase household documents with the careful neutrality of someone who will not name the thing they are describing, because naming it would give it a reality he was not prepared to acknowledge in this room. He said she had been seen in extended conversation with Duke Edwin of Carrow at the Halstone gathering, a conversation that had appeared, to observers, to exceed the normal bounds of a social exchange. He said all of this looking at her with the steady, reasonable gaze of a man who is being entirely reasonable, in a tone that would have sounded, to anyone outside the door, like a calm and considerate husband having a calm and considerate conversation about concerns for his wife's welfare. She listened to every word. She gave him nothing in return, no confirmation, no denial, no visible reaction at all, which was, she had learned, the most disconcerting thing she could give a man who relied on reading the room. He pressed on. "I want to understand," he said, with the particular tone of a man who does not want to understand anything, "what it is you believe you have found." She considered her response for a moment, carefully. She said, "I've found a great deal of interesting reading in recent weeks. I've always had a curious mind. You know that about me." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "Isolde. Caspian." She met his gaze with the same directness she had always used, that he had always found inconvenient. "Are you asking me a direct question? Because I am perfectly happy to answer direct questions." He was still. She could see him deciding, working out whether directness or obliqueness was the more effective tool in this specific moment, and then she watched him make the calculation and arrive at his conclusion. He abandoned the performance of inquiry. His voice changed register, slightly, to something more compressed. "I am telling you," he said, "that you are in a situation you do not fully understand. That what you believe you know is considerably more complicated than you have been able to perceive from your position. And that involving outside parties in what are essentially private family matters would be extremely damaging, primarily to you." He paused. Then he said, with the careful precision of someone delivering a prepared line, "Your condition has been of concern to me for some time. Anyone who has observed you over the past year would agree. The dancing, the late nights, the fixation on matters outside your appropriate sphere. These things have been noticed, Isolde, by people whose opinions carry weight." There it was. She had known it was coming. Rosalind's visit had been its announcement, and yet receiving it fully, here, in her own room, from his own mouth, with his careful eyes on her face and the cold December evening outside her window, required something of her that she had prepared for but could not have entirely anticipated, the act of hearing it and not visibly breaking. Nervous instability. Hysteria. The ancient, reliable machinery that turned a woman's truth into her pathology, that transformed what she saw and knew and had documented carefully into evidence of a disordered mind, that gave a husband in Caspian's position the legal and social authority to remove a wife who had become inconvenient and replace her with the story of a woman who had sadly become unwell. He had spoken to physicians. She could hear it in the precision of his language, your condition, those who have observed you, the clinical framing of ordinary grief and resistance as symptom. He had laid the groundwork already, quietly, in the weeks since Rosalind's visit. He had people who would confirm what he said. And she had nothing, nothing visible, nothing that the world could see, except the word of a woman they had spent 3 years positioning as unstable. She held all of this completely still behind her expression. Then she let the fear show on her face, not all of it, but enough. She let her hands tremble, just slightly. She watched his posture ease. He spoke for another 10 minutes after that, and his tone had shifted into the solicitous warmth of a man who has confirmed what he came to confirm and is now delivering the terms of the arrangement. He spoke about rest, about professional care, about a retreat somewhere quiet, somewhere suitable, somewhere a good doctor could help her recover her equilibrium. The word equilibrium appeared 3 times, with the particular, telling frequency of a word someone has recently been advised to use. He was almost kind about it. He produced his handkerchief when tears arrived at her eyes. He said he only wanted what was best for her. And sitting in her chair with his handkerchief pressed to her face, Isolde thought, with the strange, detached clarity of someone watching themselves perform from a slight distance, that he might even half believe some of it. That the self-story of a man who has controlled and diminished and quietly ruined people for years required him to believe, on some level, that he was reasonable. That he cared, in his way. That he was, in the final accounting, simply protecting something complicated. She gave him the tears. She gave him the trembling hands. She gave him just enough quiet collapse to satisfy the story he had come to confirm. He was a man who needed her to be small. She was the least small thing in the room. He left 20 minutes later with the settled, composed manner of a man who has handled a difficult situation and handled it well. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, descend the stairs, fade. Then she sat in her chair for exactly 2 minutes and did nothing. She breathed. She felt the weight of the evening press against her chest and she let it press, completely, without fighting it, because her father had taught her that the only way through a very large thing was through it and not around it. Then she stood. She crossed to the writing cabinet in the corner. She opened it with her key, the only copy, and looked at what was inside, the neat stack of transcribed notes, the carefully ordered evidence, the letter from Phoebe Cray given with both hands and the specific, painful hope of a woman who had waited too long for someone to act. She looked at all of it for one long moment. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not his handkerchief, her own hand, and her face went completely still. Not the blankness of suppression. The stillness of someone who has stopped performing entirely and arrived, at last, at themselves. She thought of the girl on the cliffs. The barefoot girl who danced in the rain. She thought, you are still here. You have always been here. Good. Now finish it. She sent Marta to Edwin's man that same night with a sealed note containing a single, clear message. The timeline needed to move. She had 4 weeks until the Ashwell ball. 4 weeks was sufficient. Over the days that followed, she worked with a precision and focus she had never applied to anything before, not because she had lacked the capacity, but because she had never before had something worth being precise about. She finished the documentation. She wrote each piece of evidence clearly, with its source, its corresponding public record reference, its affected parties named and verifiable. She wrote 3 summaries of different lengths so that whoever received them could engage at whatever level their role required. She had everything delivered in careful parts, through channels that Marta had spent 14 years building without ever imagining they would be needed for this. the village grocer's delivery boy, the lending library's weekly cart, the household laundress who moved between 3 different estates on her regular circuit and attracted no attention whatsoever because laundresses never do. She moved invisibly. She moved fast. And on the last evening before the ball, alone in her sitting room with the door locked and the fire burning low and the small music box playing its mazurka in the minor key, she danced. Every step she knew, by herself, in the firelight, for the last time before everything changed. She danced like the girl from Cornwall who had never learned to be afraid. She danced like someone coming home. The Grand Ashwell Ball was the most anticipated social event in the county calendar, and Ashwell Park rose to the occasion with the serene authority of a house that had hosted 3 generations of important evenings and was entirely confident in its ability to do so again. The estate sat on the edge of a low hill above the town, its long front drive lit by 2 rows of lanterns on the night of the ball, the pale stone facade glowing amber and gold against the November dark. Inside, the ballroom had been prepared with an attention to detail that bordered on the reverential, hothouse flowers arranged along every surface, white roses, lilies, trailing ivy, their fragrance warm and rich in the candlelit air. A full orchestra of 20 musicians occupied the gallery above, the sound of their warming scales drifting down through the vaulted ceiling like music deciding what it wanted to be before committing to it. The parquet floor was polished until it reflected candlelight like still water. The receiving room smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses and the particular quality of anticipation that fills a room when everyone present understands, without knowing how they understand it, that something will happen tonight that has not happened before. 40 of the county's most important people, gathering in their finest, smiling their careful smiles. Not one of them knew what they had come to witness. They arrived at 9, Caspian and Isolde, in the vain carriage with its crest and its matched grey horses and its driver in good livery, the correct arrival, precise and appropriate. She had dressed with deliberate intention, a gown of deep gold silk, cut simply, no excess ornamentation, the fit perfect, the neckline modest. Marta had spent 3 hours on her hair, dark and warm, pinned with a single strand of her mother's garnets, small enough to be understated, beautiful enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Her mother's earrings at her throat. No fan, she needed her hands free. When she came down the staircase at Vane Manor, Caspian had looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling into the managed pleasantness he habitually wore in public. She descended without acknowledging the look. She moved with the particular quality of stillness that her father had called her most remarkable attribute, not the stillness of someone holding themselves back, but the stillness of someone who has nothing left to hide and therefore needs no performance. The November air outside was cold and clear and smelled of wood smoke from the tenant cottages down the lane. She breathed it in. She was ready. She had never in her life been so completely, absolutely, entirely ready. The room was at full animated pitch when they arrived, the warm, golden, self-generating energy of a gathering that has found its own momentum. 40 guests in full complement, senior peers and their spouses, 2 crown officials whose presence was noted and whose roles she knew precisely, the county's most prominent landowners, their grown children, the full apparatus of the world that had for 3 years watched her diminish without comment. Lord Ashwell received them at the entrance with the comfortable authority of a man at ease in his own home and in his own life. He kissed her hand and said warmly, "You look wonderful this evening, my dear. The room will be glad of you." She thanked him sincerely and moved into the gathering with Caspian at her side, and she began the performance of her social role with the smooth expertise of 3 years' practice, greeting, smiling, remembering the right details about the right people, asking the right questions. It was automatic now. The part of her that managed the social performance ran independently, like a clock that keeps time without requiring thought, while underneath it her actual mind was running a different calculation entirely, tracking the positions of Edwin's men near the entrance, noting Marta in the servants' corridor through the far door, watching the orchestra settle into their positions above. 43 minutes. She had 43 minutes. Caspian was magnificent. She watched him across the room with the clear-eyed, detached attention she had developed over years of study, and she understood, with the specific, unwanted clarity of someone who has looked at something too long to pretend otherwise, that he was genuinely gifted at this. He read a room the way other people read weather, instinctively, accurately, with the ability to adjust his approach in real time to what the room needed from him. He moved through the gathering as its natural center of gravity, and the room oriented toward him the way all rooms eventually did, and he accepted this with the practiced, unforced ease of a man who had never known what it was to be in a room that did not receive him this way. She watched him find Rosalind across the space, a brief look, a brief nod, a communication that required no words because fluency had made words redundant between them. She watched him find Edwin of Caro at the far end of the room and deploy the warm welcome of a man with nothing to fear, which was, she thought, the final and most complete proof of how thoroughly he believed himself untouchable. She watched him look at her twice across the room. The second time, something sharpened in his gaze, something that said he was beginning to read the energy of the room differently, beginning to feel the current shifting. She was almost sorry there was nothing she could do about the next 40 minutes for him. Edwin was positioned near the orchestra gallery, speaking with Mr. Forsyth, the Crown official whose seat on the Revenue Oversight Board she knew precisely, because she had made it her business to know everything precisely. Their conversation looked social. It was not. As she moved to the drinks table at the far end of the ballroom, Edwin came to stand slightly behind and to her right, and without looking at her directly, he said, under the sound of the orchestra beginning to settle, "Forsyth has the one-page summary. The full documentation is with 2 of my men, who also have the sealed affidavits from Phoebe Cray and 3 other affected parties." She looked at the middle distance and kept her expression warm and social and said, equally quietly, "Marta?" In the corridor with the originals and 2 independent witnesses. Both willing to testify. She took a small sip of her champagne. "Rosalind?" A brief pause. "Present. 3rd table from the left." Isolde did not look. "She will try to intervene when I begin." "She will not succeed," he said, with the flat certainty of a man who has made the necessary arrangements. She nodded once, barely perceptibly. "When the waltz begins," she said, "I need the floor clear of other dancers." "All of them?" Another pause. "It can be arranged," he said. She set down her champagne glass. The orchestra above was lifting their bows. Rosalind found her with 20 minutes remaining, appearing at her elbow with the smooth inevitability of someone who has been managing their approach for several minutes and has timed it with precision. She was extraordinary this evening. The garnet gown, diamonds in her hair, the full deployment of everything she had, everything she was. She looked at Isolde with something that was almost, underneath all of it, beneath the performance and the calculation, almost real. Almost afraid. "Please," she said. Just that one word. Her voice was low. The warmth in it was genuine, Isolde realized, the genuine warmth of a woman who had made choices she had long since justified to herself, but who was now, at this specific moment, beginning to see the end of the story she had told herself, and feeling the ghost of what she might have been before she chose all of this. "I don't want anyone destroyed," Rosalind said. "I don't want you destroyed, Isolde. Whatever you believe about me, that much is true." Isolde looked at her for a long moment. She thought of Phoebe Cray on the library step in her mended dress. She thought of Aldous Cray in the field with his capable hands doing work beneath his capacity. She thought of old Mr. Drews, 40 years of good tenancy, his home gone. She thought of the receipts he had kept in a tin box for decades, proving payment no one would look at. "Then," she said, not unkindly but with absolute clarity, "you should have made different choices." Rosalind's face did something complicated and private. She stepped back. She said nothing more. The room had reached the warm, amber, fully loosened pitch of an evening at its most beautiful, conversations fully alive, the first dances completed, the champagne making the candles seem brighter and the ceiling seem higher, when the orchestra shifted position above and the conductor raised his baton. The opening notes of the Viennese waltz moved through the ballroom the way warm air moves through water, slowly, gathering shape, becoming something. Isolde was standing at the edge of the dance floor. She set down her glass on the nearest surface. She felt, for one sharp, unguarded moment, the full memory of the last time she had danced in a room like this. The laughter, Caspian's face, the cold splash against her spine, the long walk off the floor with her arms at her sides and her chin lifted and the inside of her in pieces. She felt it completely, without flinching, because that night had made this night possible, and she had come to understand that the most painful things you survive are sometimes the very things that build you into what you need to be. She stepped onto the floor. The crowd nearest to her stepped back, slightly, by instinct, making room, the way people make room for someone moving with a particular kind of purpose. She lifted her arms. She closed her eyes. She began. And the room, for the second time in her life, went completely and utterly still. She danced the way she had danced as a child on the cliffs of Cornwall, completely, without apology, without performance for anyone watching, as though the music had been made specifically for the space between her ribs and she was simply letting it out into the room where it had always belonged. The waltz was 3 minutes long and she gave every second of it, the gold silk moving with her, the garnets warm at her throat, her dark hair catching the candlelight as she turned, the parquet floor reflecting her movement like water reflecting sky. And the room, 40 of the most important, most carefully composed, most thoroughly practiced people in the county, went quiet. Not the embarrassed quiet of the Blackmere ballroom, where the laughter had been already building before she stopped. Not the snickering quiet of people preparing to dismiss something. This was entirely different. This was the held-breath quality of a room that has just recognized something real in its midst and does not know what to do with the recognition. She was not performing for them. This was precisely, exactly, what made it impossible to look away. She was not doing this for any of them. And they knew it. The other dancers had cleared the floor without being asked, stepping back of their own accord, the way people naturally make space for something that has a right to it. Even the orchestra played a degree softer, a degree more carefully, as though they understood they were accompanying something that required respect. Caspian was watching. She knew this with the specific, internal certainty of a woman who has spent 3 years learning to feel his attention from across a room. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She knew what he was seeing, not the diminished, managed, carefully contained version of her he had spent 3 years constructing, not the pale blue satin decoration on the Blackmere floor who had lowered her arms and walked off in silence. What he was seeing was Isolde Marin Ashby, exactly as she had been on the day he found her in the garden with dirty hands arguing about rose beds, exactly as she had been on the cliffs of Cornwall with the wind in her hair and the whole Atlantic below her, exactly as she had been before he had spent 3 years trying to make her smaller. The original. Unedited. She heard, through the music and the silence, the sound of his movement across the room, controlled, measured, but faster than his usual pace, the particular speed of a man who has just realized he miscalculated something significant and has very little window in which to address it. He was moving toward the floor. He was not going to reach it in time. She already knew this. She had planned for precisely this. She stopped at the center of the floor as the final notes of the waltz dissolved into the silence of the room. She stood in that silence for exactly 3 heartbeats, long enough for it to settle, long enough for every face to be oriented toward her, and then she spoke. Her voice was clear and steady and reached every corner of the ballroom without effort, because she had her father's quality of speech, the particular tone of a man who had spent a lifetime being believed, and she had been practicing the words for 3 weeks, in her sitting room, with only Marta present, until they were as natural as breathing. "I apologize for interrupting the evening," she said. "I have a matter of significant urgency to bring before this company, and I am grateful to have witnesses of your collective standing." She paused for one beat, one precise, deliberate beat, and then she looked at Caspian, who had stopped moving 10 feet from the edge of the floor. She looked at him directly, completely, with full and open eyes, and she made sure he could see in her face everything she had hidden for 3 years, The clarity, the capability, the furious, focused, unbroken intelligence of a woman who had been underestimated, methodically, at considerable cost to everyone who had done so. He looked back. His expression was entirely controlled. His hands were not. They had closed into fists at his sides, the only part of him he had forgotten to manage. Over the past 6 years, she said, turning to address the full room, the estate accounts of Vane Manor have been fraudulently maintained to conceal the systematic overcollection of tenant rents across 4 counties. The official submissions differ from the actual collections by a figure that, across the period in question, amounts to several £1,000s, money extracted from farming and merchant families in this county, many of whom you know by name. She paused for a breath, even and unhurried. Several of those families have been ruined. The Cray family of Greymere, Mr. Aldous Cray, a linen merchant for 11 years, fraudulently stripped of his business and his home through a false debt scheme built on a counterfeit endorsement. The Bowl family. The Pattersons. Old Mr. Drews, 40 years a good tenant, removed last autumn for a debt he has receipts proving he paid in full. The room was so completely still that the candles seemed to have stopped moving. The documentation supporting these claims is being provided to the appropriate Crown officials now. Copies have been given to Mr. Forsyth of the Revenue Oversight Board, to Duke Edwin of Carrow, and to 2 independent witnesses whose testimony has been taken in writing. The originals are in a sealed repository. From the door to the servants' corridor, Marta stepped forward, carrying a leather case, Edwin's 2 men flanking her like bookends made of quiet authority. The room began to murmur. The sound of water finding its first crack. Caspian spoke because there was nothing else left to do, because standing silent in the center of that room while his wife dismantled 3 decades of careful construction was the one option, the only option, he could not take. "This is a fabrication," he said. His voice was controlled. "Barely. These are private household documents removed without authorization by a woman suffering from a significant episode of nervous disturbance, and I will not allow this gathering to be used as a stage for—" "You will not allow," Isolde said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear and cut through his like a clean blade, "a great many things that are going to happen regardless of what you allow." Rosalind stepped forward from the far side of the room, because Rosalind was also not a woman who could stand silent when everything was moving, but she stopped when she saw Mr. Forsyth's face. The Crown official was reading the summary document with the focused, methodical attention of a man who has entirely left the social event and entered his professional role, and his expression contained something that was not surprise, exactly, because the most important revelations often aren't surprising so much as confirming, but was the particular set of a man who has found the evidence he suspected existed and is now thinking entirely about what happens next. Rosalind sat down in the nearest chair. She looked at nothing. Her hands were in her lap. She had the appearance, for the first time since Isolde had known her, of a woman who has run out of moves. Mr. Forsyth looked up from the document. He looked at Caspian Vane. Then he looked at Isolde. Then he said, with the measured, impeccable restraint of a man trained to manage public moments of considerable consequence, "Your Grace, Duke Vane. I will need to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Tonight would be preferable." The words were perfectly polite. They were also, in the complete silence of the ballroom, understood by every person present to be the beginning of an ending. Caspian's face did not collapse. He was not that kind of man. And even now, even here, he remained composed in the fundamental way of someone for whom composure was not a skill but a structure. But something left him. Slowly, visibly, like light leaving a room one window at a time, the performance of the good man, the generous Duke, the trustworthy institution that had always been there and would always be, it did not fall away dramatically. It thinned. It thinned until what remained was just a man, standing in a ballroom, in the light of 200 candles, with the specific, terminal stillness of someone who has just understood that the story is over. Lord Ashwell had moved to the center of the room and stood there with the grave, watchful composure of a man who has seen important things before and understands that they require witness. He did not intervene. He simply stayed. That, Isolde thought, was its own kind of justice. Later, much later, she stood alone on the stone steps of Ashwell Park in the November night, with the cold air coming off the dark fields and the lanterns still burning along the drive and the stars overhead doing what stars do regardless of what happens beneath them. The gathering was not finished. It would not finish for hours, because important events require processing, and the English aristocracy processes things by talking about them at considerable length, but she had needed air, and no one had stopped her from taking it. She heard the step behind her and knew without turning that it was Marta, who placed a warm wrap around her shoulders without a single word and came to stand beside her in the companionable silence of two women who have done something significant and are still in the process of understanding what it means. There was much that was not yet resolved. There would be proceedings. Inquiries. The slow, grinding machinery of consequence moving forward through its proper channels. There would be a future full of uncertainties and difficulties she had not yet imagined. There would be, she was almost certain of this, with the quiet certainty of someone who has just proven to herself what she is capable of, a morning when she woke in a house that was entirely and only hers. She thought of her father. She thought of Ashby Croft and the cliff tops and the smell of the sea and the rain on her face and the girl who had danced in every kind of weather without once being ashamed of it. She was still that girl. She had always been that girl. They had tried, very hard, to make her forget it. They had not succeeded. She turned her face up to the cold November sky, and she breathed, deep and slow and free, for the first time in 3 years. Somewhere behind her, through the great lit windows of the ballroom, someone had found the piano. They were playing a waltz.